We'll go. And hello, allow me to welcome viewers here. My name is Jerry Salyer. I'm a liberal arts educator who runs a series of interviews whereby I talk to some of the most interesting academics, scholars, and public figures around. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Thaddeus Kozinski. Dr. Kozinski has taught philosophy and humanities for 10 years at Wyoming Catholic College, where he also served as academic dean. And he also teaches theology for Divine Mercy University, and also teaches great books for Angelicum Academy. So welcome, Dr. Kozinski.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Yes. So I'll just say, one of the things I do a lot of is reviewing books, and sometimes, sometimes books kind of sit around and I don't get a chance to look at them, and then I happen to pick one up and actually start looking at it. And I can say that was the case with this book here. And of course, for viewers, this is Dr. Kozinski's latest book, Modernity as Apocalypse. Sacred Nihilism and the Counterfeits of Logos. And I think, there's a number of passages that leapt out at me, but I would say, one I think that just really grabbed my attention sharply is towards chapter 15, and I'll just read a brief sentence. A serious problem within Christian discourse among those who consider themselves Orthodox Christian conservatives is the existence of a certain secular orthodoxy or ideology masquerading as authentically Christian. And I found that, I read that, I said, I probably need, rather than just writing review, I need to call up Dr. Kozinski and talk to him, because that really leaps out at me. And it's certainly, as I'm sure you realize, it's a very provocative statement. So we could start with that.
Sure.
If you elaborate on that for the viewers.
Well, I think that what you have is a form of idolatry, and I don't think it's willful or deliberate or conscious among a lot of people. But it is de facto, you might say, material ideology, not formal, in the sense that what's actually thought and taught and believed in and argued are claims, principles, even a worldview, a systematic worldview that isn't fully in harmony with the will of God, with Scripture, with Christian tradition, and with the perennial philosophy and its application to especially political and economic matters. And so, the first time I saw this was when I was reading encyclicals of especially Leo XIII. This was about 20 years ago or so.
Oh.
And I remember reading certain encyclicals like Immortali Dei and Libertas Praestantissimum on the Christian Constitution of States, the first one, and on the nature of liberty. And I had been, habituated to think according to the American political conservative discourse in both politics and economics. When I read these encyclicals, I couldn't believe this was the Catholic Church teaching. I had never heard or been encountered this way of speaking about matters of church and state and political order and economics. This wasn't even Rerum Novarum. This was the pre-Rerum Novarum. These are the encyclicals that don't get discussed much among conservatives, and that's precisely because you can't fit a lot of these statements into the paradigm of Lockean liberalism, if you want to put it that way. And I noticed that these weren't taught at most college curriculums in conservative Catholic college, or if they were taught, they were kind of handpicked and not taught in full, or they were dismissed or reinterpreted out of existence. The old first things before Dr. Reno was really a kind of notorious for this, for dismissing passages in Immortale Dei that called for more or less the ideal of the Catholic confessional state as outdated, historically odious, and just not to be taken seriously. And I thought, okay, well, maybe there's an argument to be made for which elements of an encyclical are de fide and perennial, and which are historically conditioned. But I didn't see an argument there. It was just a claim, and it was sort of like a everybody knows kind of argument. Like, what are you doing defending these things? Everybody knows that, Dignitatis Humanae, makes these this prior political theology defunct. But I didn't buy that. And so I just started to notice this about 20 years ago. And this would be the political correctness on the right, as I call it in one of my essays.
Sure.
You have the leftist version as well, but I think they both meet. They both share a kind of common distaste for those elements of Catholic social teaching and the perennial philosophy which don't fit into whatever ideology we're talking about, however we want to label it: Enlightenment, neoconservative, classical liberal, Lockean liberalism. But what I've noticed, of course, over the last 5 years especially, is that this is now talked about. People like Michael Hanby and David D.C. Schindler. And, there's also the integralists like Adrian Vermeule. So this is no longer a verboten subject. So I'm glad to see that.
Yeah. Yeah, I was, and I guess that's off the subject of ideas and so on. But I find it interesting that you also, when you refer to the old first things, so it's not just me. I remember noticing I'm actually kind of interested in stuff in first things all of a sudden. There's a period when, and I'm not, trying to be, run anybody down, but there's a period when I was not really that interested in what got printed in there. And all of a sudden I've noticed, like, repeatedly, hey, that's really interesting. So something obviously happened.
Yeah, one gets tired of reading Michael Novak.
Right. It just, I guess, so why would, do you think it was, so it's partly new leadership, but also could it be like, events in the world have kind of, I would, maybe have forced people to think?
The idea is just one. I remember the senior David Schindler was just treated like a weirdo and mocked, and he, in his writings in the early 2000s, and now the Schindlers have been vindicated. Okay, no one the best book that's probably ever been written on liberalism is D.C. Schindler's Reality. I reviewed it on The Imaginative Conservative. It's just absolutely stunning book, and he takes Lockean liberalism to task. And it's phenomenal. That book could not have been written, could not have had any cachet, maybe even 10 years ago. But now it's, they're having conferences in Notre Dame about it. So there's a good thing going on in a Catholic intellectual discourse. Of course, at the same time, it's also not good. There's good elements, but there's also still many of the bad things that I talk about in my book going on. We can get into that at some point.
Sure. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. Why not? Well, returning to your book, another, and I guess since we're on the topic of kind of how conservatism has worked, one of the things you mentioned in the book and this is something that, I dredge up. I always tend to like to recall things. It seems like people forget, but Kim Davis, for instance, there's a time when she was on all the headlines. I think a lot of people, probably a lot of kids I deal with, have no idea who Kim, the name doesn't even ring a bell, because that was the Obama years. That was a whole another era.
Yeah,
but it was really strange how she got treated. You could speak to that.
Well, I actually got an art. You write for Catholic World Report often, don't you?
I do.
My essay in the book was in Catholic World Report, I'm happy to say, and it was on Kim Davis. And my first instinct when I read about this was defend this person, this divorced Seventh-day Adventist, relatively uneducated woman with probably a lot of odd theological ideas. Okay, sure. Yet she resisted She resisted the anti-logos structure of law that put her in a position to go against her conscience.
Right.
And she didn't resign. And she simply said, no, I refuse to sign these marriage certificates, these marriage licenses, because it goes against God's law. And instead of conservatives, Christians rallying around behind her, they mocked her, they disparaged her, and they called for the rule of law. We have to obey the rule of law. Okay, well, let me say something about the rule of law. What we're dealing with is lawlessness under the cover of law. And we could see this now more than ever with the COVID-19 hysteria and the riots and the mask cult. So St. Paul in Thessalonians talks about a restrainer on the lawless one. And he says that this restrainer will be lifted, okay? And what we have is absolute lawlessness. What I mean by that is a kind of spirit of anti-logos. Logos meaning the order of things, the order of the universe, incarnated in Jesus Christ. A so-called ironclad law of the land that requires you to support the demonic parody of marriage called same-sex marriage. You're supposed to support. Now, everyone believes that we should have rule by law, but an unjust law is no law at all, St. Augustine says. So why were conservatives criticizing Kim Davis for not supporting a law that went against the divine law? How do you explain this? And it just baffled me. All these pious, noises made about we're a nation of laws. We can't cause anarchy by picking and choosing which laws we're going to obey or not. I mean, this is a recipe for absolute failure. This is what I call internalizing the command. This is what I call internalizing the commands of your oppressors. And I mean, did you get? Are you sharing similar concerns about how she was treated at that time?
Well, I mean, one of the things that I got out of it is almost like a little. I mean, I don't really know. I mean, it's not really a theory, but there's like a phenomenon that I find fascinating. That there's her, and then also you could probably say the Phil Robertson, the Duck Dynasty guy who got in trouble around that time. There's almost this odd phenomenon of these people who were in no way fitted to be like fighting, what they call the culture wars. They're actually doing it, and the people who are the intellectuals and supposed to be the leaders are not doing their jobs.
Exactly. And if you're in a position of establishment, there's a kind of strange hypnotic habituation that happens where all of a sudden you become someone who supports what really is unsupportable, indefensible, just by virtue of your being like part of the ruling class, part of the intellectual class.
Right.
And then you have these nobodies who just are looking at things simply, and they say, no, I can't support this, and they do it, and then they get attacked by those who should be supporting. Philosophers and intellectuals are called to serve the common man, okay? We have this great education, this training. We've been gifted with this articulateness and ability to understand ideas and history, and we're supposed to support those who don't have those gifts and haven't been privileged to have that kind of education. And yet the opposite's happening. I'm finding this, I'm supporting reopen movements in my local town, reopen businesses. And I've been part of a Facebook group. We've had rallies and I've given speeches, and it's kind of and it's an interesting, I've met so many people who are just ordinary, good, kind of conservative type Americans here in the belly of the beast in Central California. And they don't have the education, the training, the understanding, but I'm working with them. And there's so much more sanity and understanding of these things from a gut level than there is among the intellectual rulership that we find in conservative Christian and Catholics. Now, there's certainly exceptions to this. I mean, there are people who do get it. and are in positions of influence. But there is a kind of treason of the intellectuals going on. And I saw that with Kim Davis. And it's all caught up with, your tribe, who's looking at you, who's going to give you the prestige and the kind of pat on the back for, and it's also kind of like an arrogant, like elitist thing. Like, oh, we can't associate ourselves with the Kim Davises of the world. I mean, are we really going to like think that she's our hero? It's kind of snobbery. Almost.
Yes. Well, and I mean, the thing that I find obnoxious about that is that, I mean, these are often the same people who are sort of have this very imperialistic view of democracy and equality throughout the world. I mean, they tend to trumpet these things, but like those are I mean, if snobbery is ever inexcusable, it is when somebody who it is in people who drone on and on about democracy.
Yes, I agree. It's there's so much deceptive language in the discourse. There's so much sophistry. It's Orwellian that Orwell couldn't even imagine. And it's ratcheting up. It's getting worse and worse, and it's causing a lot of people just like mental instability at this point.
Sure.
When the discourse gets corrupted, that's a much more deep corruption, as Joseph Pieper would say in his book, Abusive Language, Abuse of Power. When discourse is corrupted, well, who talked about this too is Thucydides. He has a great passage about the plague. And then he talks about, I forgot the city it was, but they had a revolution. He talks about how language was distorted and words meant something different than what they were meaning. And it sounds like he wrote it for today. It's incredible.
Right. I think I remember I know there's somewhere in there where he talks about like, supposedly Sparta, they're the oligarchs, the Athenians are democracy. And he says, at some point, that's like that doesn't mean anything at all.
Well, he says things like, ruthlessness and cunning are now touted as courage and holding fast. And, that one, I'm talking about.
Right. Okay. Yes.
Evolution. The discourse gets corrupted, and he compares it to the plague. He has a kind of oblique reference to what happened in the plague. And if in the plague, there was absolute decadence and just orgies, and it was just like complete overthrow of logos, and it was like demonic. And he says that this discourse is corruption is analogous to that, even though it didn't descend to the levels of physical debauchery. But anyway, it's a lesson for us. And intellectuals who have the privilege of being in the public, they have to kind of heal the discourse and never misuse it. And it's so easy to misuse it and get what you want by misusing it. It's so easy to sort of to be sophistical and use that for your advantage. I mean, you can get away with it. You can. I mean, who's going to stop you, really? And so it's the more power you have over discourse, the easier it is for you to use it for your own agenda and own self-aggrandizement. So in the end, I don't know. It's a sacred charge to be a public intellectual rhetorician,
right?
And you have to accept that it should be a lonely position. You're not going to get the pats on the back if you're really telling the truth. You're just tough. It's a tough road.
Yeah.
I've found myself getting into hot water with talking about controversial subjects. And you try to keep your job, and there's a kind of there's particular instances where people are losing their jobs these days when they're going against certain politically correct ideas. In Catholic, and the Catholic schools are happy to comply to kick them out.
Right. Well, I mean, what's interesting is that people don't. I mean, there are plenty of Catholic schools where you can find teachers who are actually teaching things that are okay. Yeah. If we look at Catholic Church, there's no way you could reconcile that with the Catholic tradition. And yet, on the other hand, if you violate, you get fined. So in effect, there's an orthodoxy. You need like an oath to the magisterium.
That's right.
But it's a different magisterium.
It's unbelievable.
Almost.
And I'm saying that's not just a leftist issue. I think this kind of thing happens with the right-wing orthodoxy as well. If you're in a conservative school, there's certain orthodoxies that you can't go against as well. I have a whole chapter on that.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, well, and it's what, to use the Gramscian term, I mean, so you say liberalism is hegemonic. So whether or not you've got a left wing or a right wing, like, yeah, everybody's, I mean, it's only, there's a few people who are kind of poking their way out of that hegemony, but it dominates both sides. And unfortunately, the conservatives don't even seem to realize this.
Yeah, I think a lot of this is unconscious. It's not really, people aren't really aware of what's happening. I think it seems to me, because as you get more established, as you become more influential, and you're sort of part of more higher echelons of education, of law, of politics, of think tankery, and all that, I just feel like you have to be careful. You have to be so much more vigilant about the unconscious and subtle effects on your own thinking, your sense of identity, your tribal allegiances,
Right.
and before you know it, you've been compromised. It's a dangerous thing. It's like, it's a very dangerous thing now to want to be kind of rise up in influence, because be careful what you wish for.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Well, I mean, that's the famous, to gain the whole world, but lose your soul. I mean, that's, yeah.
And you don't know it, because the people you surrounded yourself around are all becoming like-minded. You get this house of mirrors, or echo chamber effect. And obviously the blogosphere is notorious for just not allowing real dialectic. It's just, you're just listening to yourself. It's just this self-enclosed, airtight little tribal talking clubs.
Right.
I don't know. I could name names, but I guess I don't have to do that.
Right.
All right.
Oh, yeah. I mean, yeah, whatever you. Yeah. I mean, of course, the flip side of this is it also seems to be, I mean, one of the problems with the discourse today, the reason we cannot have, like, I cannot have a useful conversation about all kinds of all kinds of subjects with, certainly with somebody who is, identifies as on the left, or even many people who identify on the right, because it's like there has to be some sort of critical mass or some common ground of things that we can, I mean, usually if somebody's Catholic, I can, depending on what the subject is, if somebody's Catholic, I can talk about at least some things. I mean, I can, for instance, people who go on and on about democracy, and I'm not a monarchist myself, but a lot of people assume I am, just because I don't think monarchy is like this terrible evil thing that we should, aren't we? It's like we've been redeemed from monarchy. Well, no, I mean, it's a form of government. I mean, it's, that's fine. But I mean, I can't, if somebody's Catholic, I can usually maybe kind of point out, well, there's, monarchy was pretty much accepted. Although even with some Catholics, that's a hard thing to float.
Well, it's not so much the form of government, I think, is as important as the fact that before the modern state, there was no absolute centralized monopolization of coercive power. Okay, the political power was mediated and shared with messy overlapping kind of jurisdictions, and there were cultural and customary authorities. It wasn't just the state.
Right.
With the rise of Napoleonic France and in the American Constitution, you have this centralization of coercive power based on the models of Hobbes and Locke. There's three authors that are exceptional on showing this. One is William T. Kavanaugh, great theologian. Another is D.C. Schindler, and another is Peter Simpson. I've been reading Peter Simpson's work. He's a SUNY professor in New York of classics. He's got a great translation of Aristotle's Politics. And he's written a book called Political Illiberalism. I can't recommend this enough. Enough. And he shows that the main problem is not whether it's monarchy or a republican democracy. The main problem is the idea that there's this state which has the absolute monopolization of both power and authority, and everything else is under it in a sort of non-political, privatized, depoliticized manner. And so there's nothing checking the state. Okay, it's not the people. It's not the church, obviously.
Right.
And he makes the point that the purpose of political order is happiness. It's to promote happiness and help people to get there. And we all want ultimate infinite happiness. And if the state, if the political order in conjunction with all other institutions are not ordered towards helping us to become virtuous and happy and fulfill our end,
Right.
then what's going to happen is that end of fulfillment and perfection is going to be put second place to another end. And what is that other end? It's simply the arbitrary power of the state. Okay, and that's diabolical.
Yeah.
So what you have now with this mask edict. So I'm in California. Governor Newsom, after 3 months of this virus, he now says everyone has to wear masks inside. Now, first of all, he has no legal authority whatsoever to authorize anything over an individual California. It's not how governor politics works. Secondly, there's no law in California that requires you have to wear a mask. And third, these masks are actually terrible for your health, and they don't help to stop the virus. I've done a lot of research on this. And here's what's happening. People are conditioned to obey arbitrary authority now. And that's the purpose of this, is to say, we're going to say you do this and you do it. And if you don't, you're going to be shamed. You're going to have people even maybe being violent towards you. You're not going to be able to shop in stores. I mean, what's next? You have to crawl out on your stomach inside because the virus is only 3 feet up or something. It could be anything. It's the conditioning to obey unquestionably arbitrary edicts from the state. Now that's idolatry. And Christians have to be the ones to resist this, because we have a God that we obey unquestionably. It's not the state. It's the true God. And I think what's happening is people are starving so much for some sense of order and authority that they'll give it to anything. They'll give it to some psychopathic narcissist like gruesome Newsom, and they'll obey him as if he were the voice of God. And you're seeing this among Christians, among conservatives. I mean, I was the only one not wearing a mask at the mass the other day I went to. It was a Latin mass too. The people are sitting there, everybody's wearing these masks in church, and I'm thinking this is like something out of a horror movie. So I'm just saying this to me is bearing out stuff I've written about in my book and about the unquestioning obedience to the state. And this state is not left, it's not right, it's not Trump, it's not anti-Trump. It transcends that whole dialectic, in my opinion.
Well, actually, because I don't know if the idea of the managerial state. I think that was popular.
Jim Kalb.
Yeah.
James Kalb was great on that. He had a column in Catholic World Report for a while. Really good stuff.
Yeah. I mean, the 1984, Orwell didn't just come up with that. That was a notion, I guess, that was floating in the air of like this new system of government, which it wouldn't be democracy. It wouldn't be a traditional society authority. It would just be this bureaucratic entity, that would be all powerful.
Well, that's just a necessary logical entailment of the Lockean state. It starts with John Locke. D.C. Schindler has proven this beyond a doubt.
Okay.
But anyway,
could you elaborate on that? Yeah.
Well, we could. I don't know if you had another quote though, maybe, but if you wanted to talk about it, I didn't want to.
Okay. Okay. Well, we'll go and then we'll take a look at your book then.
Look, I mean, Schindler's book is a tour de force, and he basically argues that for Locke, potency becomes before actuality. He basically reversed the metaphysical principle of act before potency. And this has so many ramifications. The nature of freedom becomes the perpetual openness to being potent, potentially open choices, right? And this connects with the nature of the state. The state is there to guarantee this kind of perpetual, infinite openness of possibilities. Okay, I mean, it's completely diabolical. That's the subtitle.
But doesn't make any sense, right? Because the minute you make a choice, it's like potency, but you aren't allowed to ever actualize it by deciding.
No, but
anything.
Yes, that's right. And keeping yourself in a state of perpetual openness to more and more possibilities is precisely the kind of existential situation that people are put in. And so when they do make a choice for something, it's absolutely meaningless and arbitrary. And so it's a kind of nihilistic worship of nothingness as freedom. Okay, and you see this more and more. I mean, this is what transgender stuff is. This is what
Yeah.
homosexual marriage is. These are all just empty counterfeits of reality. Okay, and so people are thinking that if they're able to have a counterfeit of logos, of the order of things, they're free. But they're actually, as Schindler says, free from reality. So freedom from the real becomes the sort of dogma, the first spiritual principle, commandment. Be free from the real, because the real is oppressive. Okay, it's an unchangeable, God-ordained order. You're either accepting that order as something you could be participants in a loving dance with being, or you want to be outside of that dance, always trying to choreograph it yourself. But the only way to do that is to sort of set up a counterfeit dance.
Yeah.
And this is the culture of death. This is the culture of nihilism. And Schindler shows how this is directly connected with John Locke's notion of the social contract state and the monopolization of all power. Actually, Peter Simpson does an even better job of connecting it to that in his book. But anyway, if you have another quote, we're at 40 minutes.
Okay,
so.
sure. Well, yeah, all right. If we go a little bit over, I mean, that'll be all right. You know,
all right, I'm okay with that.
Okay. I mean, maybe my superficial take, I'd always just kind of, the way I looked at it was that, Locke replaced, before Locke, I think there was a consensus that, the nation was kind of like a family, and he replaces it with the idea that, this is like a business enterprise, and we're all just, we're not really part of a big family where we're concerned for each other. We're just we're trying to make a profit.
Right, but the difference is that profit business. Well, Alistair McIntyre says when you have to go to war in a liberal secular state, it's like dying for the telephone company.
Yeah.
And that's what you're talking about. And then William Kavanaugh says, no, you have to kill for the telephone company. When you have to go to war. And yes, you're right, but that telephone company becomes the only public authority, and everything else has to defer to it. And so the only public values that are permitted are utilitarian and self-serving, individualistic.
Right.
Okay, but that's setting up a church above the church in a sense, and that's the problem. The church is our ultimate authority, and the political order has to be subordinate in some sense to the spiritual and the transcendent. And Lockean liberalism makes that impossible.
Right.
Because as he says, every church is orthodox to itself. He sets up a kind of religion of religious liberty based on a kind of theological relativism, perspectivism. And he sets that up metaphysically and theologically, but he brings it in under the cover of like nature and self-interest and, what everybody knows. But it's actually based on a kind of false anthropology, false metaphysics, all the way down to the level of physics. And this is what Schindler shows, that he's putting potency above actuality. It's the ultimate deception to do that.
Okay.
Anyway, read the book. But
sure. Yeah, there's a kind of going back to the idea of like ordinary people and so on. The chapter in your own book where you talk about Catholic education and the cult of theistic evolution. That's also kind of that's a hot topic. And I, myself, a few years ago for Chronicles, I went up to Northern Kentucky we have the Creation Museum up here, and also there's like this huge Noah's Ark thing up here. And I'll be honest, I mean, I would not accept in the metaphysical sense. I wouldn't call myself a creationist, but I meet these people, and they're really nice people, and I know a lot of people who would identify as creationists, and I can't help but think, when I look at the problems America's facing today, I don't see these people as being the ones you can put it at their door. Maybe if you were a leftist, you might say that, because you'd say, well, they don't respect science, and that's why we're having global warming, and da 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 da. But I mean, what's striking again is that conservatives, I mean, as we kind of mentioned earlier, there's a lot of conservatives who tend to have a pretty disdainful view of the sort of the hoi polloi, I guess. But anyways, you can maybe elaborate on.
And so I just noticed that there is a debate that's intellectually respectable that students should be given a fair portrayal of, instead of always being taught that, oh, this is what some, fideist, wacko Christians and Catholics teach, and here's the
Right.
respectable position. Whenever I see that, it always just shows me that there's an ideology going on. And again, it's not fair to the students. I have several chapters on education in the book. And I'm very insistent that students are not to be dictated to in the classroom. It's one thing when you're teaching students what are the dogmas and doctrines of the church,
Right.
or what is the teaching of a certain philosopher or something like that. Yeah, you could do instruction. But when it comes to the bread and butter of a class, you have to be teaching students how to perform dialectic and how to think, and become, as McIntyre says, dependent rational animals, independent inquirers. And so you have to be very careful not to impose your own particular categories of thought as if it were reality on students. I'm not saying it has to be open-ended, free-for-all seminars where there's no truth. I experienced that at St. John's College when I went to grad school. But it also can't be this kind of rhetorical mode of teaching where it looks like it's Socratic, but in the end, the teacher is basically guiding them to think as the teacher thinks. And that's guru-ness, and that's not liberal education. You said you're into liberal education. I bet this resonates.
Yes. Well, although, yeah, I with my students, anyways, I don't find there being too much danger of me getting them to think what I want them to think. They kind of go everywhere, but I suspect there are probably some teachers who are more, able to kind of point them to whatever preordained answer they want.
Right, and it's not like we're not trying to form them. We're trying
Yeah.
to we're trying to use our experience, our understanding, and our knowledge that we've acquired, our wisdom that we might have, to point them to what's real, so that both of us, the teacher student, are looking at what's real. But we're not supposed to be pointing them to our interpretation of what's real. It's a very subtle difference, but
Right.
I'm very insistent that as teachers we have to let go, and really serve the students. It's so easy to serve ourselves in the classroom, to serve our prestige, and to and to become kind of a false authority for these students because they're starving for it. Anyway, so I saw this in the theistic evolution discussion,
Mhm.
and it's sort of like it doesn't even matter what the truth is sometimes. It's just, well, what would people think, kind of thing. Like, what do the people I respect in my little tribal group, what do they think is a respectable viewpoint, or a respectable person, or a respectable book, or a respectable organization? And
Right.
those organizations might be voicing arguments that are very trenchant and very articulate and very truthful about certain issues, and it doesn't matter because it's all about the ethos. It's all this rhetorical mode, you know. I mean, there's an interesting. I mean, it's more than just theistic evolution. It's a lot of issues that are not really debated because one simply can't go there. One
Right.
simply can't go to that. In other words, that conclusion is verboten, and it doesn't matter if it's true. It's just, I mean, it's rampant, this kind of thing in Catholic intellectual discourse. So, for instance, like, this is a good example. The first thing, go back to the first thing. It was verboten. It was forbidden to critique the American founding.
Okay.
Um,
Yeah.
you know, to critique Locke, to critique kind of conservative classical liberalism, to critique kind of Michael Novak's understanding of democratic capitalism.
Right.
You got mocked for this, okay? And well, what happened? Now it's perfectly fine. It's hip to do this. You know, there's a whole movement of distributism and critiquing Whiggery and Whig economics and Robert Sirico and we can critique these places now. We can critique the Acton Institute's understanding. It's not like they have the authority, like to determine what it means to be a Catholic American and how you think economically. It's changed, but 10 years ago, the people who were saying, "Look, let's critique this," were persona non grata, and it just keeps happening over and over again. This kind of thing.
Yeah, now as far as I guess to play devil's advocate for the American founding, I guess some people would argue. I guess it does. It puts us, as I've often said this to people, it puts us in an odd position because there's a kind of. I do think there's a kind of, for the lack of a better word, like a piety, like towards the forefathers and all the founding fathers and that sort of thing, which I think is legitimate and good. But at the same time, that's kind of in tension with the question of, well, Thomas Paine, as you're probably familiar with, there's some, or for that matter, Jefferson, some of his, again, I always kind of have to bring up the Jefferson Bible, and because I would almost feel like I was being dishonest when I say, well, he did try to rewrite the Bible, which I can't, I can't defend that. So I guess there's a tension, I guess. But again, there's people who don't acknowledge the tension. They just say, oh, no, just anything that doesn't work or any problems, you just throw it out and that doesn't matter. Like, no, it does matter.
No, I agree. I agree that it's a subtle thing, but I'm just saying that, like, it's okay now. Like Michael Hamby's article, a great article in First Thing on the American civil, what was it now? The civic constitution of American Christianity, or something like that. It was a landmark article he wrote, and that critique that he was giving of Lockean liberalism, of the good Enlightenment, right? There's the bad Enlightenment, which is the French, and it's
which is totally different from the good Enlightenment, of course.
Yeah, there's the good Enlightenment, right? Well, no, maybe the good Enlightenment isn't as good as we thought.
Right.
And so,
or maybe it's more like the bad Enlightenment.
Well, that's right. And so I'm just saying that's okay now, but 10 years ago it wasn't. And do people see, like, well, maybe there's things right now that I think are off the scale and a kind of outside of my paradigm, and I suffer cognitive dissonance whenever I think it might be the case. Maybe it's precisely those things that could be the case, and so anyway, that's just a pet peeve of mine.
Sure. Well, I think there's a quote, McIntyre, in one of his, some essay of his, I don't remember the essay, but it's something to do with natural law, where he says something like, it would not exactly be the case that the more objectionable a view is to respected persons, the more likely it is to be true. But, there might, I feel like he kind of suggests that, well, the fact that something is objectionable might actually make you kind of take a look at it and consider it.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, well, he's famous for saying that the discourse of American liberalism, you've got conservative liberals and radical liberals, but you don't have anybody questioning liberalism. It's like you can't get underneath big L liberalism. Well, that's not the case anymore. McIntyre is one of the pioneers of being one of the first public intellectuals to really do this, and he's now been completely vindicated. But of course, I think he's gone off a little bit. I have an article in my book critiquing him, because we see now with let's get into this a little bit.
Sure.
In an essay, in a speech McIntyre gave at Notre Dame, I don't know how long ago it was, over 5 years ago, I think. I think it was justification for coercion, and in that speech, he calls for a few things that just baffled me. One of them was mandatory vaccines with no possible dissent, because if you dissent from that, you're dissenting from science. He said this.
Wow.
And that's just one example. Another was a kind of military draft possibility. I mean, at least he was like moving towards that for the sake. In other words, what he was doing was he's saying, look, we believe in the common good, right? Well, the common good requires public health, and public health has to have authority. We can't just dissent from this. Now, this to me is very naive, at the least. And now we see what's happening with the COVID. I mean, there's a good argument to be made that the lockdown and the hype about the dangers of this was influenced a lot by Bill Gates. Okay, that's not a conspiracy theory. I mean, he's a population reductionist. Okay, he's talked about this, and we know that the WHO and the CDC and Fauci and Gates did this is a corruption, big time. And so, okay, so really, we want to have mandatory vaccines for this? Okay, and so anyway, it's just amazing to me that this disjunct sometimes, and between somebody's excellent brilliance and erudition, but then they could be so naive. And maybe it's because, oh, you're one of those anti-vaxxers. Oh, you're a conspiracy theorist. If I hear one more Catholic use the phrase conspiracy theorist, I mean, it's insufferable. Okay,
Well,
it's
I mean,
insufferable.
to me, the thing that's galling is we've had to like put up with for the past almost 4 years now this whole idea that Vladimir Putin installed the current administration in the White House, and like this is not people in there with tinfoil hats saying this is the New York Times, and somehow we're supposed to be sensitive, like, oh, don't call me a conspiracy theorist. I mean, obviously the mainstream accepts conspiracy theories with very little evidence,
Of course,
provided it serves their own agenda.
A conspiracy theorist is just someone who doesn't believe the claims of known liars. Okay, that's my definition of conspiracy. Not to say there aren't some people who are off their rocker and flat Earth is insane, and it is a phenomena among a very small amount of people. But that's not the way they're using this phrase.
Yeah.
They're using this phrase to debunk anything but government control. The fact-checking thing is unbelievable on Facebook. I mean, I don't know. I've had posts fact-checked, right? It's like, this is so Orwellian.
Right.
Who checks the fact-checkers? Who guards the guardians?
So it's the idea that these experts exist like in some Olympian plane, and we can trust them.
And they're unquestionable.
Yeah.
They're a magisterium.
Right.
They are the magisterium.
Right. Even with regards to the COVID thing. I can vividly remember there was a time when it was. I mean, at one point my wife was afraid of going out with a mask on because she was afraid people would attack her because it was, oh, don't wear masks. You're not supposed to wear masks. And then all of a sudden now it's like, if you don't wear a mask, you're going to get attacked if you go out.
Now, listen, Jerry, that's deliberate, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm pretty convinced that arbitrary switching like that is a psyop. It's meant to condition people to accept arbitrary commands. Even, double plus unthink in 1984.
Yeah.
That's what that is. You're supposed to believe two contradictory things at the same time and have no trouble with it. I mean, I'm telling you,
it's like an exercise.
That seems to, yes, it's conditioning. I'm telling you, I think that's what's going on with that, because it's having that effect.
Whether it's intentional or not, it does have this. You do have the sense sometimes that it's almost like we're going to put. I mean, I've thought that about some political candidates who've been put forward. That like the idea that like this is totally outrageous, but we're going to put this person forward just to show that we can do it, or to do. There's all kinds of things that it's a demonstration of power.
Yes, exactly.
And then that demonstration makes the thing that reinforces the power that it's demonstrating.
Look, there's so much power in what I call the sleeping giant. I have noticed in my dealings with people I would have never dealt with other than this virus, because I've gotten involved in the local politics here where I am.
Mm-hmm.
And there is a sleeping giant of people who are awake, who get it. And I don't know if it's a majority of people or not, but they need leaders. They need those who have education and influence to serve them, to articulate their understanding of things. And yet we have such divisions. The devil has divided Catholic intellectuals amongst themselves because they're just fighting for their think tank status and perch, or they're fighting for their next conference, or all this kind of prestige wars. And again, the ordinary person who's intuitively sensing this onslaught against their health, their mental health, their spiritual health, their families, their communities, they want to do something. They don't know who's doing it, how to fix it, as much as they should know, they could know, they just don't. And they need leadership. and they need us to help them, and not this fake leadership.
Right.
And I don't think Trump is gonna save the day here.
Yeah, that's not, I appreciate it, but I was almost thinking, I remember before the last election, I was kind of thinking, well, probably, I actually, I mean, like a lot of people, I thought he could win, but I kind of figured that Clinton would win. And I thought, well, the silver lining of this is people will not be deluded into thinking, that, we'll kind of be put up against the wall and realize, okay, we need to get serious. I almost kind of feel like because, they perceive somebody, that because Trump is in the White House, a lot of conservative, Christians, conservative Catholics have kind of taken the, they still don't they don't want to acknowledge, so long as he's in the White House, like, oh, well, things can't be that bad. Like, no, things really are that bad. I mean,
Yes, they are. I
yeah.
agree with you. I agree with you.
So maybe and we've got just a little bit more time. I wanted to address one towards the beginning of your book. There was a point that I found really fascinating, and I think it's good. I mean, it's good that somebody makes it who is clearly and unequivocally devoted to the Catholic tradition. And that's that's a point. I mean, I think if I understand it, you're kind of addressing an issue that sometimes happens, or a problem that sometimes arises in, I'd say, traditionalist communities. I don't really like using that label, but we kind of know what we mean. People who are we have a attachment to Latin. We appreciate Latin liturgy, and we recognize the church was not invented in the 1960s or when by John Paul II, that it's ancient, it's got an ancient tradition. But here, so there's this quote here where you mentioned, by encountering the partial truths in other traditions, we are more able to recognize partial truths as partial, both in other traditions and in our own. Including the partial way in which we finite and flawed humans inevitably appropriate and understand those non-partial truths contained within our own tradition. And then I think the part I really appreciate, and you have this in the I in italics, I am not tradition. In other words, it very often happens, I mean, I've noticed where there's always a danger of people kind of, mistaking, this mistaking themselves for the tradition itself.
Yeah, who's really good on this topic is Evelyn Underhill. She's the great writer of mysticism, the English Anglican, and she wrote a landmark book on mysticism. But before she gets into mystical theology, she talks about epistemology and just knowledge itself. And she has very beautiful, articulate, even poetic way of talking about the way in which reality itself always exceeds our grasp of it. And it's inexhaustible. I mean, it's one thing to say that the mysteries of the Trinity, exceed our grasp, of course, but a flower, an event in your life, yourself, even natural realities, the reality of them is full of the mystery of God. Now, having said that, I'm not going to say that you can't know things. Okay, I'm an Aristotelian. I'm a Platonic Aristotelian or Aristotelian Platonist, however you want to say, and Thomist. So yeah, the mind can know things. Knowledge is adequatio rem and intellectus. Okay, so the mind and the world coming together in union. Yes, union is possible. We certainly don't want to think that all we know are our ideas about things. That's Locke, and that puts us in a solipsistic bubble we can't get out of. Once you go there, you can't get out of it. But we also don't want to say that we have this kind of easy identification of our ideas and our perspective, our subjective appropriation of reality with reality itself. There's always more to learn. There's always more to inquire. There's revision to be made about our ideas. There's correction. There's depth. It never stops. And that's because reality is always pulling us into participation with it. I mean, knowledge is a kind of participation with something greater than us. And so we have to always recognize that our particular understanding of things is partial, is limited, is relative to our own sort of matrix through which we see things. At the same time, I don't want to say that leads to relativism. Okay, So I like to call it the relative absolutism of truth, right? So it's not absolute relativism, which is obviously ridiculous, but it's also not absolute absolutism. um, Reality is reality. Our knowledge of reality isn't reality. Our knowledge of reality um, can be more or less accurate, but it's an ongoing negotiation, and it's a never-ending quest. It doesn't mean you can't have certainty about claims and statements. It just means that your understanding of what the words and concepts signify in your certain statement is always going to leave something to be desired. Let's put it
Uh,
that way. So I'm trying to articulate a kind of middle position between what I see as extremes in, in how we approach our own knowledge of things, and not just on a religious level. Now, having said that, when it comes to dogma, Christian doctrine, it's not really the same dynamic here, because the certainty that you have about a doctrine of faith, it comes from God. Okay, God's giving you the gift of that certainty. You're just cooperating with it. Now, the amount of understanding you have of the reality signified by that doctrinal truth is obviously going to be like a shadow, like a dark glass, right?
mhm.
Um, but the level of certainty has nothing to do with your grasp of it. The level of certainty comes directly as an infused virtue of theological virtue from God. And so, as some theologians have written, the certainty we have about faith is greater than the certainty we have about anything else in the world, any kind of truth whatsoever. We're not certain about it as much as we have about the certainties of our faith, because those certainties come as a gift from God, through sanctifying grace, and our cooperation with it. So, yeah, anyway, I have a few chapters where I kind of touch on this issue, and I touch on it in relation to cultural things, because I found myself, when I became open to things more that I thought I had a handle on, I was helped to see things I couldn't have seen, without that openness. So my first experience of this was in traditionalist Catholicism. I got caught up in the traditionalist kind of thing for a while, and I had this like lens, but through which I saw everything. And an event happened in my life which broke me out of that lens, and it led me to recognize that I was caught up in what I call the Gnostic traditionalism. I have an article on that too. It's not in the book,
Mhm.
and it's kind of ideological. I wasn't seeing things correctly. I wasn't entering into human relationships healthily. I wasn't understanding the real understanding of the church's situation. I was caught up in certain narratives that I was getting, fed by that little tribe I was in. Now, I have nothing against the Tridentine Mass or
Right,
critiques of bad interpretations of Vatican II. I love the traditional liturgy. I really don't like to go to anything but that, Byzantine or
right.
Latin Mass. But what I'm talking about is this kind of, um, I don't know how to say. I had a shrunken grasp of things, precisely because I wanted to have the full truth, and I thought that somehow, to become like identified with this little group and the way they thought about things. And I noticed that if you questioned any of it, you had the same response that you had when you questioned other things, like leftists. If you questioned it was a similar response, right? And so that got me thinking that this was a bit of a cult-like Gnostic atmosphere here, not healthy. And I think that's what's happened to a lot of subcultures in Catholicism, is that they get caught up in reactionary mode, and they find themselves in an echo chamber, and it's dangerous, to say the least.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of seems like that you could say that modernism and postmodernism are kind of flip sides of the same coin. With the Enlightenment, you have people more or less deluding themselves into thinking, all these various ideologies. We have all the answers to reality, and
Yeah,
when
the
that
view
doesn't
from
work,
nowhere.
they say,
Yeah.
well, there must not be any truth at all.
Yes, you have the view from nowhere, where you have this perfect objective reality, a scientific method, or some kind of enlightenment mode of knowing that gives you the absolute truth, and it prescinds from anything that has to do with tradition or religion or culture. Right? It's sort of, I call the view from nowhere.
Right.
And then the reaction against that is there are only perspectives, and none of them can be adjudicated from any position whatsoever. Right. And the answer, McIntyre is a genius on this. The answer is tradition constituted rationality. And he really does the best job in showing how knowledge is both tradition constituted, but also tradition transcendent. So that it's a masterful stuff. You have to read his trilogy to see it. But I think I have some things in that in my articles on Charles Taylor and modernity towards the beginning of the book. Yeah. Charles Taylor is another great one, but don't have time to talk about him.
Right. Well, all right. Well, I think we'll close on that, and it's I thank everyone for watching, and thank Dr. Kozinski for speaking with us, and invite anyone watching to subscribe to this